imagine the scene. A husband comes home from work, he falls down onto the sofa, and his wife says to him, "Well, what are we going to do tonight?" And the husband says, "Well, I don't know what you're doing, but I'm going round to visit Stacey." She might look at him a little bit confused and say, well, who's Stacey? And the husband says, "Well, that's my other girlfriend." How do you think that wife might respond? She'd be a little bit angry, wouldn't she? In fact, she'd be greatly angry, and rightly so. We all know that that conversation is wrong, because in a marriage covenant, each spouse deserves the other's total allegiance. That's what a marriage covenant is. And as we read the Old Testament, we discover that the people of Israel, they too entered into a covenant with God. It's not a marriage covenant, but it was a covenant nonetheless, where promises were made and commitments were made. God said to the people of Israel, "I will make you my treasured possession, a holy nation, a kingdom of priests. And in response, I want your total obedience from me." In other words, what God said to the people of Israel is this: "I will honor you if you honor me." And so the king of Israel was the one who was to spearhead his people upholding their end of the deal, their end of the covenant with the Lord. And obviously at this point in history, King Solomon is the one on the throne, and so he is the one who should be upholding the covenant and spearheading all of the people of Israel to uphold the covenant and to walk before the Lord in obedience and faith. But as you might recall in recent chapters, things have went pretty well for King Solomon. He's led the people relatively well, but there have been subtle hints that there's been a few bumps along the way. You might recall those as we worked through previous chapters. And now in chapter 11, we see unfortunately the climax of Solomon's rebellion. This is a devastating chapter where we see that all of these little patterns of subtle compromise have reached their climax and resulted in outright rebellion against the God of Israel. In this opening few verses, you can see how King Solomon married many foreign pagan wives in direct violation to God's law. In fact, verse 3, you'll see that King Solomon actually had a total of 700 wives and 300 concubines or prostitutes. This is shocking. And this rebellion just spiraled and snowballed to the point where in verses 4 to 8 you can see how we're told that Solomon's heart turned to other gods. And those gods are listed for us. Furthermore, he started building pagan shrines in Israel for his foreign pagan wives to worship. This is an all-time low for the people of Israel. This is a dark chapter in the history of 1 Kings and for the people of God. And what appears abundantly clear as you read this chapter is that God is not neutral when it comes to sin. In fact, when you see verse 9, you'll see that God actually is very angry at Solomon because of his disobedience. And on top of that, God immediately issues judgment to King Solomon. He tells him that the kingdom will be taken away from him and given to his servants. And not just that, but we're told that because of Solomon's rebellion, God will judge him internally and externally until the day that he dies. As the rest of this chapter unfolds, we're given an insight into what this internal and external judgment given by God to Solomon would look like. Firstly, in verses 14 to 25, we're shown what the external judgment would look like. And it would take the form of 2 individuals called Hadad and Rezon, who would distort the rest of Solomon's reign. Secondly, though, we see the internal judgment against Solomon. One of his own servants, a guy called Jeroboam, would ultimately rebel against him. We're introduced to Jeroboam when a prophet called Ahijah comes to him and tears his cloak in 12 pieces, giving Jeroboam 10 of the 12 pieces. This was to symbolize the fact that Jeroboam would ultimately rule over 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so God has exerted his judgment against Solomon for his disobedience. But not only do we see God's judgment in this passage, we also actually see his grace. Notice the numerous ways in which God still shows grace to a rebellious Solomon. Firstly, in verse 12, notice that while God will take the kingdom away from Solomon's line, he won't do it until Solomon dies. This is to honor Solomon's father, King David, who was ultimately a God-honoring king. Secondly, you'll see in verse 13 that while again Solomon's line will lose power in Israel, that not all of the tribes will be taken from him. And so God shows both his judgment and his grace to King Solomon in chapter 11 of 1 Kings. It's a dark chapter, it's a sad chapter, and it finishes with King Solomon's death, and we're told that Solomon ultimately reigned in Israel for a total of 40 years. Well, what do we learn from a chapter like this one? Well, we learn many things. One thing we learn is that God is not neutral when it comes to sin. God hates sin. It makes him angry, and it has real tangible consequences. It had consequences in Solomon's life, and it has consequences in our life. And God, as the God of justice, will allow those consequences to come to fruition. But God isn't just a God of judgment. We also see in this passage that God is a God of grace. He's revealing himself to be totally just and totally gracious. The second thing we see is how sin has a snowballing effect. In the previous chapters, Solomon's sin, perhaps we might say, was less extreme than the sins we see in this chapter. But all sin, when left unchecked, snowballs. And for Solomon it resulted in a great fall, and for us the same can be true. What sin in your life is left unchecked, and how does chapter 11 of 1 Kings cause you to be warned? But thirdly and finally, as we reflect on the reign of King Solomon, as chapter 11 ultimately describes his death, we see it was a bit of a mixed reign, wasn't it? Partly good, partly bad. And it ultimately leaves us crying out for a greater leader, a greater king who could lead his people in a way which is God-honouring and in a way which will bring restoration and healing to the people of Israel and to humanity's broken, stubborn hearts. That king is who Solomon's life pointed us to, the one greater than Solomon, Jesus Christ himself.